In this video, we'll continue our discussion of human nature by looking at Tim Lewens' 2012 paper, Human Nature, the Very Idea. So this paper is about this question of whether there's, as Lewens calls it, a biologically respectable notion of human nature, and particularly one that can kind of do ethical work for us. Lewens is particularly interested in this question of whether there's a notion of human nature that could help us understand when it's morally reasonable or acceptable to try to change ourselves. So that's the topic for next week. We're going to talk about genetic engineering, one of the ways in which we might change ourselves. So this, in some sense, sets up for that. Okay, so the basic structure of his argument goes like this. He's going to argue that essentialist conceptions of human nature are not biologically plausible, that non-essentialist conceptions of human nature don't really provide us any guidance. Therefore, we don't really get any ethical guidance from concepts of human nature. So I'll go through this kind of bit by bit. The first important thing to explain here is what he means by essentialist notion of human nature. I did some setup for that for the last video, so if you haven't seen that previous one yet, check that out. But let's dive in. Okay, so essentialism is a really old idea in philosophy. The idea that things have essences goes way, way, way back. So you can think of an essence as something that makes a thing what it is, the kind of thing that it is. This is often, you can think of this as a set of necessary and sufficient conditions. So, for example, gold has an atomic number of 79, so which is the number of protons in its nucleus. Okay, so if something has 79 protons in its nucleus, then it's gold, right? And if it doesn't have 79 protons in its nucleus, then it's not gold. So this is both a necessary and sufficient condition for something to be gold. It's necessary that it has 79. If it fails to, then it doesn't count as gold. And it's sufficient for it to be gold, right? If it has 79 protons in its nucleus, that's it. It's gold. So this is a classic essence, right? And it's really nice to have these things because you can do really clear category membership, say something is or isn't gold. You can say when it begins to be a member of that category, say you add a proton in, it becomes gold. You take a proton away, it stops being gold. It's really nice when things have essences like this because it lets us do this really powerful explanatory thing that humans really love, which is you can investigate just a little bit of gold and learn about all of the other gold in the universe. It's really an amazing fact, right? You can do a careful investigation of one little sample of pure gold down here on Earth in this weird little corner of a tiny little galaxy in the middle of nowhere in the universe. And because gold has a kind of essence, you can learn about all the rest of the gold in the whole rest of the universe. It's neat, right? So people love it when things have essences. And Lewens argues in this paper that we were sort of psychologically predisposed to maybe think in essentialist terms, even when sometimes the world doesn't deliver essences. So lots of stuff seems to not have an essence. Lewens uses the example of his desk in his office. Like there's nothing essential about the desk, right? You could take away one of its legs and replace it with a different leg. It's still the desk. You could refinish it. You could change it in any number of ways. And that's pretty much still the desk. Where there's no really clear category of Tim Lewens's desk. Probably something similar holds for all desks, right? So there's no essence of desk as far as anybody can tell. There's nothing that makes something, necessary and sufficient conditions for being a desk. So reality seems to very often not have essences. The chemical elements are in some sense, a very tricky example to work with because they really do seem to have something that counts as an essence, whereas almost everything else doesn't have essences, right? You can get necessary and sufficient conditions in physics and chemistry, probably math and logic, computer programming, maybe, but most of the world, most of the time, doesn't seem to fit into these kind of really neat, crisp categories. Despite our tendency, our sort of psychological tendency to think in these style of, there are essences of things. So when we're thinking about species, and human species in particular, we talked a little bit about what makes an individual a category of the species, and we found some difficulty in coming up with a definition. I think it's exceptionally hard. So we talked a little bit about sort of categorical definitions of species. And if you're going to come up with the essence of a species, you really need a categorical definition of it. But it turns out to be just really, really hard to come up with necessary and sufficient conditions for species membership. You could probably come up with something, especially if you're willing to play a little tricky and, you say something like, well, the necessary and sufficient conditions for being a member of Vulpes vulpes is being related to this specific fox back like 3 million years ago or something like that. You could probably jerry-rig something, but the point that Lewens wants us to notice is that it doesn't seem to be on the table to come up with an essence that would provide us with moral guidance about how we should live. So, more specifically to humans, I mean, think about this. Think about this question of like, what makes us human? What features or properties are essential to being a human being, a Homo sapien? I really can't think of anything. I really can't think of anything that I can't imagine a human lacking, but still being a human. And you better not tell me something like 10 fingers and 10 toes, because lots of people don't have that. Don't tell me something like, having hair or anything like that. Like any of our kind of gross anatomical features, there are humans that don't have it. So you might be tempted by something like genetic essentialism, which Lewens briefly considers. But I don't think that works either. And Lewens doesn't think so as well. So, okay, so think through this. Let's suppose that having certain genetic sequences is what you want to call the essence of being a Homo sapien. But all genes do is make sure that certain messenger RNA strands get produced, right? And those messenger RNA strands get taken up by a ribosome, which gets translated into a protein. So imagine the following scenario. Imagine, it's 100 years in the future or something like that. Somebody's out in space and they get hit by a blast of radiation. All their DNA is wiped out. They have no more genes. All their genes are just destroyed. However, we've got little nanobots, and those nanobots can go into every single cell and do the job that DNA did, which is just to produce the right number of RNA strands of the right type at the right time. Okay, so in this scenario, this person has no DNA, but they go about their lives just fine because the job that DNA was doing for them is being replaced by these little nanomachines. So is that person no longer human? So they've got sort of prosthetic DNA. Does that mean they're not a human anymore? I don't see any good reason to say that. And okay, so that's a bit science fiction-y, I admit, but the practical problems aren't really relevant here. The relevant thing is, is it really the DNA that makes you who you are? And I don't think it is, right? I don't think it's DNA that is essential to humans. And I'm kind of skeptical that there's anything essential to being a human, any one thing. And if it's not our genes, so suppose that you accept that that was a reasonable scenario. If it's not our genes, what is it? I really can't think of anything. Okay, so that's one way of coming up with a notion of human nature, an essentialist notion of human nature, that there are some necessary and sufficient conditions for being a human. But that's not the only way. We can think of other ways of doing this. So, for example, we might come up with what Lewens calls permissive nature. So just ease up a bit, let it be a bit looser of a definition of human nature, and then maybe we can come up with something. Because this essentialist thing is very strict, right? We're asking a lot. By asking for necessary and sufficient conditions, we're asking for something that you really can't come up with for things like tables and chairs. So why would we assume that we have that as well? Okay, so Lewens considers, so we moved on to the sort of second step of the argument. We don't have any biologically plausible notion of an essential nature. What about permissive notions of human nature? So Lewens considers a proposal from 2008 from Edward Macquarie. And And Edward Macri proposes the following as a kind of definition of human nature. Macri says, human nature is the set of properties that humans tend to possess as a result of the evolution of their species. Okay, I mean, it sounds plausible, right? That sounds reasonable enough. Human nature is the stuff that, most of us most of the time have. So weird science fiction scenarios don't really affect this because it's a matter of like what most people have. And he ties it to something sort of deep in our evolutionary past because it's stuff that we have not by happenstance, but as a result of evolution. Okay, so let's try this definition out. Lewens points out first, and I think for our purposes, this is maybe the most important counter-argument that he provides. So Lewens points out that you can define human nature any way you want, whatever. Like, you can use words however you want. They're all conventional. But this way of defining human nature really doesn't give us any kind of ethical guidance. And that was the question that he's really interested in. Not whether you can come up with a definition of human nature, but can you come up with a definition that A, is biologically plausible, and B, tells us something about how we should live? And tying it to evolution really doesn't seem to do that, right? Because, look, evolution produces lots of adaptations, and there's just no reason to think that those adaptations are going to be good in any sense other than promoting survival and reproduction. Thinking otherwise is to commit what's often called the naturalistic fallacy. This is the fallacy of thinking that just because something is natural means it must be good. Cyanide is perfectly natural, but I really don't recommend you drink a big bottle of it, right? Because it's bad for you. Just because something is good, just because something's natural doesn't mean it's good. I used the example last time. This is my favorite example to try to illustrate the naturalistic fallacy. Chimpanzees will murder and eat other baby chimpanzees. So cannibalistic child murder is something that nature produces, and it's adaptive because it helps your genes get into the next generation. So you really don't want to take what evolution does as moral guidance. You really don't. And if you don't believe me, then, if you're one of those people that produce sperm, here's the best thing that you could do. So if you think that the things that promote your fitness are the best things that you can do, then here's what you should do. You should work as little as possible so that you can travel the country and visit every sperm bank that you can. Lie to them, tell them that you're a Harvard-educated Olympian, and just try to get as much sperm out there as you possibly can. And if that doesn't sound like a good life to you, specifically in the sense of an ethically good life, then you don't believe that, whatever evolution requires of us is what's morally good. And you shouldn't believe that, because evolution comes up with all kinds of stuff that's horrifying. So just tying human nature to the stuff that most people get from evolution really isn't going to be a good way of finding guidance about how we should live. Lewens makes some more subtle and sort of penetrating philosophical critiques of this. I'll just go through these quickly. So Macri says he bases his definition on what's shared by most humans. And he does that because his goal is to come up with some sense of human nature that could be used by the science of evolutionary psychology, right? So you want something that is common across humans. But Lewens points out that the kind of things that evolutionary psychologists love to try to speculate about, like, for example, male philandering, aren't possessed by most humans and can't possibly be because half of humans are not male. So something that applies to, presumably not all males are philanderers, so something that applies to less than half the population can't be shared by most humans. So it's a picky point. Philosophers are like that. But it shows that more work needs to be done on this definition to make it even kind of make sense of the type of things that Macri wants it to make sense of. Okay. Another maybe deeper problem, and it gets us into some more interesting philosophical issues, is the other part. This is to say that what's human nature is what's a result of evolution. And that sounds like it should be clear, but when you start picking away at it, it turns out to be not so clear. So it's just really unclear how to parse things into results of evolution and not results of evolution. I mean, my name is Corey. Presumably that's not a result of the evolution of our species. However, Lewens wants to ask whether cultural evolution is a kind of evolution. And if it is, then it becomes really hard to parse things into results of evolution and not results of evolution. So there's a debate about this in the philosophy of biology literature. Is cultural evolution a real kind of evolution, or is this just sort of a metaphor? But I think everybody agrees that our ability to survive and reproduce, especially as human beings, is enormously and importantly tied to the kind of culture that we pass from generation to generation. So, here we've got an image of stone tools sort of developing over about 1 million years. And as those stone tools improve, humans got better at hunting. We were more effective hunters, therefore more able to get food, and therefore more likely to survive and reproduce. So culture evolves in some broad sense of the term. The live discussion in the philosophy of biology right now is whether that's a metaphorical sense of evolves or whether that's a literal sense of evolves. But suppose that we accept that it's a literal sense of evolves, and we don't really need to, because the fact is that our culture at least sets the conditions under which we evolve, so that makes it difficult to separate out culture from our evolutionary trajectory. But if we do accept that that's a kind of evolution, then Lewens thinks that all kinds of weird things get to count as human nature on this account. So, for example, most humans share some variant of the belief water is wet, and that's a product of cultural evolution. That idea has been passed down through our culture. It's been it's a meme, if you will. It's a meme that's been passed down and reproduced because it's very effective in helping you understand your world. But according to Macquarie's definition, shared by most humans, product of evolution, that means the idea that water is wet is part of human nature. And if water is wet is part of human nature, all kinds of stuff are going to be part of human nature. Lewens briefly speculates that maybe understanding the rules of soccer is part of human nature on this definition, which, again, in an intuitive sense, probably shouldn't be the case. And if you're looking for ethical guidance from this notion of human nature, it's a big problem, right? Because you want something that's sort of core, fixed, deep in us, rather than the ephemera of culture. Okay, so Lewens' broad conclusion here. So we saw that he doesn't think that there's a biologically respectable notion of human nature that's sort of essentialist. He looks at least this one example of a more permissive notion of human nature and finds, A, it doesn't give us any moral guidance, and B, it's got some problems in the way it's formulated. So, Lewens' point is very general. It applies to any species whatsoever. I'd like to take a minute here to talk about something that is human specific. So I'd like to introduce a point that I first heard from the philosopher and developmental psychologist Alison Gopnik. And this is a point about, what kind of behavioral repertoires different species can develop. Okay, so this is her bit about chickens and crows, and I just love this bit. Okay, so consider the chicken. Chickens are, in a very important sense, born smart. Like a lot of animals, after kind of like a month or two, they have essentially the entire skill set that they would have in their entire life, right? Chickens are good at pecking at things, really expert at pecking, and not much else. So if you try to give chickens complex problems to solve, they are not going to do well at it. They are not good problem solvers in general, unless that problem is pecking at things. So, but you can be a little jealous of chickens because they have it all figured. By 2 months old, they have it all pretty much figured out, insofar as they're ever going to figure anything out. Okay, but compare that to a crow or a raven, the corvids. So crows need something like 2 full years of intensive parental care, to the level of like They need for their parents to drop worms into their mouth for like 2 years. So they're pretty useless for a pretty long time, especially relative to something like chickens. But once they're fully developed, corvids can do really impressive stuff. They're capable of problem solving on the level of, some people have said, like a toddler human, or in some aspects like a chimpanzee. Pictured here is a corvid solving a problem. The problem is trying to get a bit of food that's in the water, and the solution is they drop little weights into the water to raise up the water level so that they can reach the food. It's clever, right? It's not the kind of problem that a corvid would have ever seen in its evolutionary past. Like, there weren't any glass cups in its evolutionary past, so this is a novel problem for them, and they are able to solve it. Okay, so Gopnik suggests that this really impressive problem-solving abilities, this flexibility, this cognitive flexibility, is in some sense a result of this long period of not being able to solve any problems. So corvids are not born smart. They are born not smart, let's say. But what they do have to have is the ability to build a mind from scratch, right? Crows and ravens build a mind from scratch. Okay, so now to bring this all back to human nature, if we're going to talk about the way humans are, I think it's I take Lewens' point to be pretty strong ones. It's an open debate. Debates in philosophy are never quite over, but I take it that he makes some interesting and important points about how it's hard to be essentialist about living things. And furthermore, if you're not an essentialist, you don't get much ethical guidance. But something that does seem to be very regular features of human beings is the following. Humans are unable to take care of themselves for a very long time. Sometimes like decades, right? Humans are... we're born pretty useless. Babies just kind of flop around. Toddlers have to be prevented from harming themselves constantly. And you might think of this as a kind of bug in our design, right? You might think that this indicates that we are badly put together. But Alison Gopnik makes this point. So consider the crow and consider the chicken. So we have this even longer period of developmental plasticity. And what you end up with is a mind that's even more complexly self-organized. That is, you created your mind from scratch. Humans do this process of building a mind from scratch longer and harder than any other animal on the planet. We have to build our mind bit by bit. Now, of course, babies come with some stuff built in. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to acquire the ideas and skills that they're going to use later on. But the proportion of things that we have to figure out on our own is probably much higher than even the crows or ravens do. So the chicken is born 2 months later, it's done, it's ready to be a chicken. The crow or the raven, several years, humans, several decades. And if you want to call that our nature, I think that's an interesting place to start. We are unique amongst other animals in being self-making in a deeper and more profound sense than any other animal. And what that means is that we are more flexible in our minds, in our behavior than any other animal. So we have this rich set of opportunities afforded by nature, rather than having a set of sort of set points, a set of built-in behaviors or ideas. What we have is a set of built-in opportunities for self-making. And if you want to think of human nature in that way, I don't think it gives us much ethical guidance. So the next question is, okay, then how should we build ourselves? And what I just told you gives you no answer about that. But I do think that it sets up a kind of interesting picture of the type of beings that we are.